Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those new to the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Marc DeVore. He's a specialist in militias and conflict. Today we'll be discussing the role of militias in modern conflict. Their role between civilians and the military will take a special look at the situation in Ukraine, but we'll also take a look at other recent rise in the role of militias and various armed groups in other hotspots around the world. Before we delve into the discussion, I'll let Dr. DeVore introduce himself and his specialty in this area.
Well, thanks for inviting me on, Irina. It's great to actually meet you virtually after having looked at your work for quite some time. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, which is the third oldest English-speaking university in the world and Scotland's oldest. I did my PhD at MIT, focusing on both security studies and comparative politics. And it's sort of from that background that I ended up gaining exposure to non-state armed groups, militias, self-defense organizations, insurgencies. And this has been in a lot of different parts of the world. For a summer, I ended up working as the assistant to an elderly French war correspondent, Jacques Duchemin, spending time in the former Yugoslavia and accompanying him to the last of the Yugoslav wars, 2001 in Macedonia. Through a series of accidents, I ended up working for the government of the Central African Republic and being an advisor to President Ange Felix Patisse in 2002-2003, which got me some very firsthand experience, both in a fragile state, seeing how important non-state armed forces can be, but also how problematic they can be. Later on, academically, I did research in southern Lebanon, looking at Hezbollah as an organization. I spent some time in Libya in 2012 after the revolution there, looking at the different profiles of non-state armed groups that emerged in resistance to the Libyan regime. So sort of an interest that's taken off from there. Subsequently, I also ended up in Kurdistan, where I ended up doing a study examining the differences between the two major Iraqi Kurdish armed groups, the KDP and the PK and the PUK. So that's sort of where it starts. And obviously, as with many of us, I'm quite gripped by what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. So is there anything more that you'd like as an introduction?
I think that's fantastic, and I hope you tell us a bit more about some of your experiences as we go through the various issues. But I'd like to start off with kind of defining the terms, because for lay audience especially, but also for experts, the words militias, armed groups, self-defense organizations, even terrorist organizations, they are sometimes interchangeable. Sometimes you have this Venn diagrams of different words that can mean different things in different contexts, and sometimes there are connotations that are negative or positive depending on the context. But what is the difference between a militia, for instance, an armed group, armed self-defense group? Is militia a type? Is simply a type of a self-defense organization, or is it something different?
Well, that's, Irina, is one of the most aggravating questions in the history of the world. So
I'm like that.
Well, some of I think the most painful experiences I've had have been sitting in on conferences on terrorism, where whenever somebody questions what is the definition of terrorism, you can know that there's time to spend the next 2 or 3 hours of just zoning out as individuals rehash an alphabet soup of different definitions. But it is an important issue. So from my perspective, the simplest distinction amongst armed bodies are those that belong to states and formally belong to states, and those that do not. So militias as a category tend to be a subcategory of non-state armed groups. But then it becomes complicated because sometimes states become in some ways the godfathers or godmothers to militias that they don't control, but they employ. So within militias, one tends to distinguish between pro-government militias and other militias. There's a lot of other ways that this can be dissected. Sometimes with militias, there's a connotation of part-timeness, which distinguishes it from other types of full-time paramilitaries. And there can be there's a connotation that militias attempt to hold territory, which distinguishes them from insurgents or terrorists who are oftentimes against the state, but not attempting to hold any specific bit of territory. So there's a lot of different ways that one can attempt to define a militia, but almost no definition is going to be fully adequate.
But this is a good start, especially as a basis for much further discussion on other issues, and I think this will more than suffice. Now, I do want to address another common misunderstanding, and that is, where do militias stand in terms of international law? There is a difference in treatment between civilians and armed combatants in the military context, and you could spend, and in fact, some of us here have spent entire courses trying to differentiate between terrorist organizations and criminal law and military law, and whether or not there is a gap. Where do militias come in? As a structure, not necessarily on the intent of engaging in terror or not.
Well, this is a very formidable question when it's a human rights lawyer who poses it to me. So as a political scientist, I must sort of give the standard cop-out that anything I say is likely going to be wrong, and that you probably can correct the errors of what I'm about to say. I guess the simplest thing is that the Third Geneva Convention, which occurred in 1929 and was substantially revised in 1949, basically defines combatants or the existence of a prisoner of war status as existing only in conflicts between when two or more nation states are involved. And when that occurs, the status of being a legal combatant, or which entitles you to prisoner of war status if you are captured, applies to every group or individual who in one way or other is fighting under the command of one of those nation state organizations. So partisans, francs-tireurs, self-defense militias, as long as they owe allegiance and are in some way within the chain of command of one of the nation states that's fighting, benefit from the protections of the Third Geneva Convention. Everybody else is a civilian and therefore benefits from the protections under the Fourth Geneva Convention. So that's my relatively the most simplistic take of it. Additional protocols attempted to regulate the status of other non-state groups, particularly mercenaries and national liberation organizations. But in both of those cases, the definitions, the way in which one defines a mercenary or a national liberation organization, was in some ways so fraught that those additional protocols have not had the effect of the earlier conventions. Now, that's my very simplistic understanding, but I'd actually really love to hear what a international human rights lawyer has to say on this subject.
Well, from my understanding was that mercenaries are distinct from non-mercenary militias because they don't typically enjoy the same level of protections by virtue of
Yep.
not having that same allegiance. Now, the fact is sometimes militias are very clearly semi-state affiliated or the very least function within the framework of the state, and sometimes there's a clear effort to kind of for states to divest from them completely, whether for appearance's sake or because they really don't want to have anything to do with them. And the question is, what the real dilemma is: what then? If they are not in fact quasi-state actors, or not really affiliated with the state in any capacity, or in fact they're insurgents who are challenging the state, why would they enjoy the protections by the state if they're a completely independent entity, and if they're not even really a liberation organization as much as a very shifting group? And we'll talk about more about that later.
Yep.
This shifting allegiances and shifting membership of these non-state armed groups. How who defines the protections for them, in what capacity? If they're captured, would they be held, and by whom, by which party? It's that really becomes a dilemma, and sometimes I wonder whether this is not deliberately taken into consideration in proliferating these groups. They certainly can be a destabilizing element, and maybe sometimes that is actually part of the point, the difficulty of defining who they are, how to treat them under international law, and creating these dilemmas for state actors who are generally bound by very strict adherence to rules of engagement and so forth, which these groups are not.
Yeah, no, I certainly think that states are playing upon that ambiguity, whether that's to use militias as a way of internally repressing their own populations, in a way uh, outsourcing repression to a group like the Janjaweed in Sudan, enables the state in a way to distance itself from actions that could lead to an international humanitarian intervention. Also, the use of militias, as you made the point, enables a state in some cases to intervene in foreign conflicts in a way that otherwise might not be tolerated by other states. And I think there the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is in some ways the most valuable player in terms of a group that has mastered using militias as a tool of foreign policy.
It's ironic because RGC itself is not strictly speaking a military force in its conventional sense. And some are arguing that there is a tension to some extent between the conventional military and the RGC, which has strong asymmetrical warfare capabilities, but it's also parasitizes the resources for the standing navy, army, and so forth. And there is there is competition and conflict for resources and support between those organizations. And RGC is a recognized terrorist organization by the US. The military can be sanctioned for supporting terror, but it's not the same as a terrorist organization. And military, at the end of the day, still a military, still enjoys some level of formal recognition. Even if they act in ways that are not protected under international law. So how these structures also interplay with completely non-state actors is also funny, because the funding then trickles down to these non-state militias from these transitional groups. And you start to ask yourself, how do you distinguish a militia that gets paid by a paramilitary force affiliated with a state actor? Are they really independent if they basically still function for their own agenda and advance their own agenda, or because they accept funding that's ultimately linked to a state actor, are they really an agent or a proxy of that state actor, and to what extent?
Yes, I think that's where one really faces the dilemma, because the relation between states and the non-state armed groups that they sponsor runs the gamut. Runs the gamut from almost complete control, which is my impression of things like the Kadirovsky, the Chechen militias, which were used very heavily in Donbass in 2014, less successfully in this current round of fighting, is that one's in a situation of almost complete control. And in fact, those units, while they're referred to as a militia in some senses are, also technically constitute two regiments of Russian Interior Ministry troops. So one runs the gamut from that to other organizations that may receive arms and supplies from a donor, but where the donor has very little actual physical control over them. So that raises very difficult questions, both in terms of accountability. To what extent can you punish the donor for the actions of the surrogate, as well as for trying to backwards induce what the donor's motivation is from the behavior of the surrogate.
And that actually brings us to two state actors who have employed a variety of these means to various extent. Iran, as you've mentioned, and some of its partners, proxies, and fellow travelers, Hezbollah, Hamas, which received funding but has been also pursuing its independent goals, Houthis in Yemen, and to some extent, various Syrian militias, Iraqi PMUs, and even North African Polisario, which did not start out as an Iranian proxy at all. It was a completely separate element, which was backed by Algeria and initially the Soviet Union, but how has now received training, funding, and arms from Hezbollah, which is very much affiliated with Iran and with direct connections from Iranian diplomats. So, to what extent? And on the other hand, you have Russia, and you have not only Kadyrov's so-called militias, but you have Wagner and other similar structures, which have been very much, Russia has very much treated them as quote-unquote private entities, but they also pursued Russia's foreign policy goals in countries ranging from various African countries such as Syria and Mali to now Ukraine. How do you make sense of these relationships? How do you assign accountability to this range of different levels of support?
With a great degree of difficulty. So the Russian case is in some ways somewhat clearer, I think, than the Iranian case. Russia's reliance on reliance on Russian proxies, such as the Wagner Group or the Kadirovsky, has really been a phenomena of the past 20 years, with the past 10 years having seen a significant acceleration in it. And there, it seems fairly clear that these groups are basically operating as somewhat deniable wings of the Russian state. I mean, the level of control and the level of deniability is relatively minimal. When the Wagner Group was operating in Syria, you'd see a helicopter that would be on the airbase that the Russians were operating on Syria one day with its sort of Russian registration number on the side, and the next day Wagner individuals would be posing with that same helicopter at whatever their forward operating position was. So And the Wagner personnel were flown in. A lot of the contracts under which they were operating to either take back or to hold oil fields were contracts negotiated by Russian state-owned energy enterprises with the Syrian government. So the level of involvement, or the level of state involvement is high, and the level of deniability is almost nil. With Wagner's African contracts, it's a little bit more murky, but it's also the case that at some level the Russian state is fronting the money. I've worked for the Central African government. I was in Central Africa in 2017 and saw their finances, and they could not have afforded hiring mercenaries. They wanted to, but they didn't have the money to. So the only way they could have paid for essentially the services they got from Wagner is by somebody fronting the money. Now, maybe that could be fronted in exchange for some mineral resources contracts that would reimburse it in the very long term. I'm sure that was involved. But traditionally, private military companies can't front the money to go into a scene of action without money being on the table. So, and Mali doesn't even have mineral resources that even in the long term are going to be worth anything, let alone Mozambique. So in these cases, it's clear that the host governments that have signed the contracts can't pay for it. It's clear that Russia is providing materiel as a way of backing it up. So the exact contractual details are unclear, but it's clear that this is not the normal type of contractual arrangement whereby a weak government in Africa pays to hire SafeNet or Blackwater or Aegis or any of the range of Western PMCs. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily a fan of Western PMCs, but it's clear that Russia's involvement in Africa has a much heavier state footprint in the organizations being there and doing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So with the Russian case, it's very, the sort of chain of command is pretty clear. It's not sure exactly what minister or what individual in Putin's entourage is pushing for an engagement. It's not sure how much agency Prigozhin, the oligarch who theoretically owns Wagner, has. But it's clear that these decisions are all ones that the Russian state is taking. With the Iranian case, and I don't know the Iranian case nearly as well, it seems much more murky. Certainly Iran has an extremely close relationship with Hezbollah. But the relationship is almost one that you'd expect between a larger state and a smaller state. Hezbollah is a relatively independent yet, I would say, an independent yet deferential ally of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Now then, what is the influence or what is the authority that Iran exercises on other groups that it might support directly itself or through Hezbollah? I think is only conjecture. To what extent can Iran ask Polisario to do anything? Did Iran retain any influence with the groups that it sponsored through Sudan when Iran had relatively close relations with Omar al-Bashir in the 1990s once those relations soured to a degree? I don't know. I'd be quite interested to have your opinion on that subject.
I think with Polisario, I believe the relationship is fairly new but growing. I think Iran, from the way I see it, is happy to have limited allies so long as there's a perspective for them to grow and eventually to be integrated into this network of proxies. I think the long-term strategy is to have all of them be quite integrated, even if some of them will also retain a degree of functional independence and agendas that are not necessarily priority for Iran. I don't know if um, it cannot simply pursue the same level of involvement in all areas of the world. Clearly, some areas are more stable and well protected than others, but to the extent the goal is to export Islamic revolution, destabilize local state actors, recruit allies, and build up an ideological infrastructure, I think creating these entities and forming relationships with local actors that have some level of local involvement, control, and other funding, I think for Iran that's a good place to start. And I think it does see Polisario as a potential proxy that can be grown into something similar to, for instance, the Houthis, more so than Hezbollah, because they are smaller than Hezbollah. They're not as well organized. The leadership is not on the ground most of the time, and many of the people are quite simply civilians, but it employs the same techniques as you can see in every other Iranian proxy, from Syria to Hezbollah to Houthis to even Hamas, which did not start out as an Iranian proxy at all. It started out as a Muslim Brotherhood entity, but has received increasing number of funding and support over time. I don't think Hamas will ever fully become the same level of support for Iran as Hezbollah has, but I think it can become a stronger. I think that relationship, if allowed to continue, can become stronger. I think Houthis are having. They may think they're an independent entity, but it seems to me that politically and militarily, there's a great deal of involvement and control from Iran and its other proxies and structures that Houthis can no longer be considered an independent group or just a partner. I think that relationship is certainly transition from partnership to proxy control, because we have seen an Iranian ambassador on the ground in Yemen. You have seen humanitarian groups such as the International Red Cross going to that ambassador in Sana'a while he was still alive, and not to the Houthi leadership for a relevant discussion. So we're seeing that Iran has attempted to assert itself as the legitimate authority on the ground in Yemen instead of the Houthis, who've also tried to portray themselves as legitimate authorities for a while due to their sheer presence on the ground. But when you have competing forces, it's hard to consider either of them having any degree of legitimacy, because Iran actually has I would say complicated its own effort in Yemen by going by its too direct an involvement in the political governance issues. That portion is now being seen as colonized by Iran rather than simply receiving support and weapons and so forth. And similarly with the Iraqi. So actually, I wanted to ask you about the Iraqi case specifically, because we have seen at times that the militias there, that Iran-backed Shia militias, have acted, as Iranian proxies, but at times you have seen efforts to integrate them into the formal Iraqi military and with mixed level of success. How would you characterize that relationship? And how is that different from, say, Lebanon, in the case with Lebanon?
So, I think that there's probably three major differences that explain this factor. One is the post-2003 dominance of Shia in Iraq, which is something that is unattainable by Shia in Lebanon. Essentially, since 2003, Shia have, as the largest group within Iraq, have dominated the political space have elected the prime ministers, and um, as a consequence, they can be much more independent. And that means much more independent of Iran. In Lebanon, on the other hand, Shia remain are the largest confessional group, but in a very complex landscape. And they aren't by any means the most, they don't by any means have a monopoly on political power. Shia, on a per capita basis in Lebanon, are still the poorest of the major confessional groups. And they view themselves as somewhat threatened by Maronites, by Israel sitting on the border, and by other actors. So in some ways, the feeling of being something more of a beleaguered minority forces the Lebanese Shia to remain in lockstep with Iran in a way that the Iraqi Shia don't have to be. So I say that's the first difference. The second difference is the emergence in Iraq of several very distinct, very powerful Shia entities. And that makes it difficult for them to be dominated in any easy way, because there are significant rivalries between the Sadrists in terms of the followers of Muqtada al-Sadr, those who have been followers of the Ayatollah Sistani, those who have backed other important Shia parties or paramilitary organizations. So in some ways within Iraq, the intra-Shia conflict has also made it difficult for Iran to exercise the same influence it has. And when Iran tries to get too hands-on in Iraq, it becomes increasingly unpopular because while Iraqi Shia are Shia and remember and have relatively bad memories of the way in which a series of Sunni military strongmen treated them, they're also Arab Iraqis who have a very strong sense of nationalism and don't want to end up as a colony of Iran. So, and I think that in a way is different from Lebanon, where you originally had two Shia, you by the mid 1980s had two Shia movements, Amal and Hezbollah, but Amal has in some ways become so racked by corruption and Lebanese patronage politics that Hezbollah has an almost monopoly on that part of the political landscape in Lebanon in a way that no single Shia actor can in Iraq. So it means that if Iran wants to collaborate with a powerful local Shia actor in Lebanon, it has one address to go to. And its efforts to do so can be more constructive and don't end up alienating the three other major Shia political movements, as is the case in Iraq. So I think those are the major reasons why Lebanon looks different from Iraq. In some ways, I think that the one thing that has kept Iran's influence as large as it is in Iraq is the failure to reconstitute a real Iraqi army. Essentially, the United States trained quite decent Iraqi units, but those became quite undermined by corruption and patronage politics, nepotism, and the like after the American withdrawal, which led to the Iraqi army collapsing like a house of cards when Islamic State launched its offensives around 2014. So I think it's the difficulty of reconstituting a solid Iraqi army that has kept Shia paramilitaries prominent, which is the reason why Iran has still had something of an entree into Iraqi politics. But whenever it overplays its hand, that tends to backfire.
So all of these factors should have actually provided assistance to Western counterterrorism efforts in Iraq, but instead we are seeing that Turkey is becoming an increasingly big player. Qatar has benefited from ideological influence operations. Saudis and Iraqis have largely backed out, and the US has been unable to effectively employ or unify these Shia movements against Iran, other than through Sadr, who himself has been very unreliable. How do you explain the fact that US is unable to take advantage of obvious vulnerabilities from Iran's perspective effectively?
This is a question where, once again, I'd really love to have your perspective on it. My impression is that there's two things going on. One thing is it's very difficult for the conventional bureaucracies of a government like the United States to successfully navigate the type of factional landscape that exists in the more conflict-prone parts of the Middle East. It's just my impression is that the United States has never proven particularly effective in those environments. And this goes back to Lebanon in the 1980s and those failed interventions, Iraq in the aughts, Yemen these days. The American political bureaucracy just is not agile or nuanced enough to play in this type of route. US bureaucracy is great when it's dealing with unambiguous threats and alliances. The US is great for backstopping NATO. The US is relatively good at supporting Ukraine's resistance to Russia. The US is fairly good when it comes to walking certain lines between Taiwan and China. I don't think that the US, even under the best presidential administration with the smartest team of bureaucrats that one could recruit, would be able to outmaneuver Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Turkey at being able to master the factional politics of Iraq or Syria.
Well, the question is, has the US ever really tried?
Probably not as, probably your question suggests the bigger response. Probably it has not in a concerted way. It's tried at times. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan appointed an absolutely brilliant Lebanese American envoy to Lebanon. Some of the individuals who were appointed to key positions in Iraq once the Iraq went sideways around 2005, 2006 were brilliant individuals with a fair amount of nuance to the situation. But so there's at least been an understanding at some time periods that one ought to select a diplomat or an envoy or a military commander who's bright enough and has the bandwidth to manage these types of issues. But certainly reforming institutions in Washington is, in terms of being able to do this holistically, I think is probably a bridge too far, but probably also a bridge that we've never attempted to cross.
Well, that's a fair point, but that brings us to a larger point that I wanted to ask. There's a great deal of these organizations, these militias, not armed groups, non-state armed groups and paramilitaries are increasingly playing a significant role in various internal conflicts, civil wars in Syria, in Somalia, in Libya, and they're creating a great deal of issues surrounding resources, surrounding geographical areas of strategic importance, and they're being played by state actors for various reasons. And all of that seems to, the West has employed significant amount of resources in Somalia in terms of training groups there. It has been at various points involved in Syria, but without having, any particular strategy to address either Assad or any of the other forces there. Libya has also been kind of disastrous from that perspective. How is US and other countries in the West served in meeting military objectives, so counter-terrorism, counter-extremism objectives, facing this proliferation of non-state actors they're not able to manage effectively?
I think the short answer is they're not doing it particularly well. And you're 100% right that one is seeing a proliferation of non-state actors. And I think that the root reason for that in a lot of these environments is that the traditional model of the nation state's army, for one reason or other, becomes unoperational. Whether that is civil military tensions, corruption, patronage politics, or a shift in the nature of what the nation state is. So, and when that happens and a conflict occurs, you tend to get non-state armed groups that become the dominant part of the landscape. And sometimes it's very difficult to map. I mean, I remember being in Misrata in 2012, how difficult it was, even basically being adopted by one of Misrata's militias, to get any clear information about how many militias are there, how many people are in them. It becomes a almost nightmarish type of question to understand. So we obviously have not figured out how to interact adequately with militias, but also it's a very difficult problem. In some ways, I think that perhaps the first challenge that policymakers should try to address is to diagnose earlier, when are you going to get the disintegration of a state monopoly on force? Because my impression is that it usually keeps taking policymakers by surprise. Yeah, essentially, and we can look at case after case where the emergence of militias in some ways becomes a surprise to policymakers. Yeah. 1992, you have a war between Serbia and Croatia, or between the rump Yugoslav state and Croatia. It should have been relatively predictable that a conscript multinational Yugoslav army would be relatively unmotivated to conduct a war to take over a constituent part of that Yugoslavia declaring its independence. And that's what you had. I mean, essentially, the reason why militias proliferated in Yugoslavia on the Serbian side is that you had massive amounts of draft dodging, resignations by non-Serbian officers and the like, that crippled the Yugoslav National Army. And then the question is, if you can't get the National Army to fight the war that you've planned on fighting, who will do it? And at that point, you get lots of self-selecting, oftentimes relatively marginal individuals who can put together militias. So, I mean, in the former Yugoslavia, some of the first were Archon, whose name was, who was basically a bank robber and the president of a Belgrade soccer team's fan club. So basically, bank robber football hooligan creates the most notorious militia that's involved in the Yugoslav wars. Another one is a very marginal but extremely rabid right-wing politician, Sešelj, who creates another militia. So in that case, and this is in some ways a prototypical one, it's once the state's armed forces basically end up as broke, that militias become the solution. I think that was also something that we saw in Syria. Within the first 6 months of the Syrian civil war, 75% of the Syrian army disappeared. Conscripts deserted, and officers defected, and very quickly the real military ended up as an empty shell. And at that point, Assad starts calling on and creating Alawite militias. He begs Iran to intervene, and Iran gets Hezbollah to intervene, and that starts to involve a process of arming and training any group that can loosely be described as Shiite. So you gradually start developing militias to take the place of a state military that basically became defunct. I mean, the Libyan case, Gaddafi started dismantling his own military in the decade before the revolution occurred. Gaddafi had lost faith in the Libyan military and started to create a series of ad hoc brigades commanded by family members of his and recruited from a few tribes, and basically stopped funding the regular military. And then that regular military, once the war broke out, either deserted or in some cases went over to the rebellion. So militias are in some ways, in a lot of these cases that we've been mentioning, are the symptoms of a certain rot that overtakes the state's regular armed forces. And then we get surprised when a civil war degenerates into something involving 30 to 300 different violent non-state actors.
This is an important point that I actually want to address again, slightly closer to the conclusion of the discussion. Right now, I want to go back to one more sectarianism related question before returning to Russia and Ukraine for a good chunk of the rest of the conversation. That brings me back to the point we mentioned earlier about the fluidity of militias and affiliations. In both Yemen and Libya, extremely low trust, factionalized cultures, societies with a long history of internal troubles, predating these more recent conflicts by decades, in some cases centuries. We've seen that all of these parties and all of these alliances shift. We have seen migration of so-called Islamist and tribal actors to more secular groupings and militias and so forth. We have seen in Yemen, actually some of the ex-Islamists even join separatist STC forces who are generally opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth. And we have seen tribal elements move around from different factions and from different political parties, making it an extraordinarily difficult conflict to follow, much less to resolve. And that's on top of the other broader regional issues and Iran involvement for its own agendas and Iran's ability to take advantage of these internal divisions to promote its own agenda. Houthis have been able to dominate as much as they have, not solely through military training, but through the ability to intermarry into different types of networks and alliances, and by token of these family webs to kind of exercise and exert control. So in this type of environment where you have this fluidity of interests, where it makes it very difficult to not only assign blame, but to actually form alliances effectively against, problematic actors, whether they're actors like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah that's operating on the ground. How how would outside actors trying to lend support even make sense of these actors which have no clear affinity or affiliation, or which largely migrate according to the interest, sources of funding, and in and basically where the wind blows each passing day?
Yeah, I think that what you're highlighting there is one of the real challenges, and is also something that we have consistently gotten wrong. In that, and particularly this may be because of the overemphasis on the global war on terrorism, when that was the term being used for it, or on countering extremism, that by focusing on one small aspect of what's a very complex conflict environment, uh, we've at times blinded ourselves to the much broader patterns of the conflict. Um, Now, what is the way not to do that? I think the first thing is to invest a lot more resources in understanding the conflicts. I mean, it's uh, that, and to recognize that most conflict behavior is local. Yeah, most groups are control some relatively small amount of space, are embedded in kinship networks, and are trying to thrive or survive within those local confines. Um, you also have professional groups and affiliations that may move together ideologically in fairly radical formats. I mean, that a fair amount of the cadre of ISIS were former Iraqi Sunni Ba'athist uh, military officers who, uh, a decade or so before they ended up becoming the vanguard of jihadism in the Middle East, were pledging loyalty to the secular, uh, right wing, nationalistic Iraqi state. So there is, uh, people do change genuinely ideologically, but people also will rebrand and will form alliances of convenience. And I don't think there's a shortcut to understanding or being involved in those circumstances other than investing a lot of resources, monitoring, um, talking to different parties, and trying to sort things out. And if in doubt, if one can't get the access or knowledge to understand a conflict environment, one should adopt a rule of thumb of arm nobody and don't shoot anybody who doesn't shoot at you.
That's actually a very fair point.
I mean, we've ended up in the situation at times of, in places like Somalia, of at one point viewing the Islamic courts as the vanguard of fundamentalism that we have to crush. So we fund an Ethiopian invasion of Somalia to get rid of the courts, and then several years later, we're dealing with Al Shabaab, and we've discovered those same courts are the bastions of moderation that we ought to be supporting. So, you know, and so at some level, obviously, if you have a group like Islamic State that was physically carrying out as many terrorist attacks in Europe and the United States as they could, obviously you need to intervene to squash them. But when in doubt, one should probably not get involved in a place that one doesn't understand.
This lack of understanding, I think you're pointing to a fundamental problem. This is how we ended up, multiple US agencies ended up literally arming opposing groups in Syria. And this is, the situation would have been comical had it not resulted in horrific loss of lives and resources. Unfortunately, I mean, that also raises a question whether, on the other hand, a constructive involvement, a consistent approach could prevent some of this factionalism and could bring some level of stability that would allow these actors to develop their own strategies and not have to run around in search of support from one group to the next. This also lack of consistency on the part of larger actors that contributes, on the other hand, to the problem, especially if there's assurances given or expected, even if they're not clearly given, and then fail to materialize. Then these groups start looking for support wherever they can, and this results in a mess. But that now brings me to, speaking of lack of consistency, this whole situation with Russia and Ukraine also raises a lot of questions that have not been clearly addressed, articulated by people. For instance, the whole issue, the role of Wagner and Chechen militias in Ukraine. We have seen that they have largely been failing, but they're also not well understood. We don't understand why they're relatively unsuccessful compared to Wagner's role in quote unquote stabilizing African countries. And we've also heard rumors that Wagner is trying to recruit from CAR, even from Hezbollah and various, from Syria and from Iraq and elsewhere. What has happened to that, and what has been the effect of these side efforts on Wagner's role in Africa, and lending, and has their African role, on the other hand, impeded their attempt to lend support to Russia's Ukraine effort? And has there been coordination between Wagner, Chechen, any other Russian militias with the military and security services, or have they all been operating independently or in conflict? Like this picture of these different relationships has not been very clearly presented in terms of what is going on.
Yeah, it remains. I think the short answer is that it remains quite murky. But if we want to dig into the weeds, Wagner and the Chechens are not having much of an impact in Ukraine today, and I think that's to be expected. I mean, they played a tremendous role in 2014, but they played a role because Russia was trying not to commit its own combat troops. So Russia was trying to essentially detach Donetsk and Luhansk from Ukraine, but would not send official Russian combat troops, which meant that they had to rely on forces that were, I would say, implausibly deniable. I mean, everybody knew that Wagner, the Chechens, and the self-defense forces of Donetsk and Luhansk were essentially creations of the Kremlin, but it was still different than sending in the 320th Mobile Rifle Regiment, flying the Russian flag into the area. So in 2014, they had a real strategic purpose in that they served as a means for Russia to militarily engage in this project of detaching parts of Ukraine from the Ukrainian state's control, while Russia itself was not involved. But also in 2014, they had the advantage that they weren't fighting a real military either. Because of corruption, underfunding, the sudden shift in government, the Ukrainian state as such and Ukrainian military forces did not really start fighting or pushing back until the spring of 2014. So during that first half of 2014, what you largely have is Russian non-state military actors, whether those are the armed forces of Donetsk and Luhansk or Wagner or the Chechens, versus a bunch of Ukrainian volunteer battalions or militias on the other side. So under those types of circumstances, irregular or non-formal forces can be relatively effective. But militias are almost never going to perform equivalently to a state's military. Yeah, just the irregular nature, the fact that oftentimes militias begin as around some informal nucleus, and they sort of mobilize people through civil society connections. That can never compete, at least once it gets scaled up, with a full state military. So I think it's not surprising that the Chechens and Wagner are being relatively ineffectual in Ukraine. I think the bigger question is why did Vladimir Putin think that they would be more effective than they've been? And there I can only guess. I mean, I think that the relationship with Kadyrov and the sort of view of the sort of mystique that's emerged around Chechen fighters is probably the major motivation there. I think Wagner's presence there in Ukraine in the initial phases is much more surprising. So I think that's sort of the short answer on Ukraine. Now, where does this play in going forward? I actually think that given the Kremlin's reluctance to call up regular military reserves, they're calling up NCO reserves and they're calling up retired officers, but they don't seem to be willing to call back to the colors substantial numbers of conscripts who've done their service and have now returned to civilian life. And I think they're unwilling to do that because there's a recognition that popular support for the war may collapse once you have started to call up former conscripts. So at that point, the question that Russian leaders face is, how do you generate military replacements? And their private military actors may be more useful. The fact that Wagner is in these African countries does mean that they can potentially recruit people from local militaries that they've already been training, and move them to Ukraine. I don't think that provides a lot of combat power, but it's sort of equivalent to Putin's overture to Assad, essentially asking, can I come over and recruit 18,000 Syrians? It provides semi-trained military bodies. So I think that is probably how its utility is going to be viewed now. I think there might also be some expectation that Ramzan Kadyrov, being a very brutish person, might be able to Shanghai Chechens off the street and to flesh out those units in a way that the Russian government is afraid to call upon its own more regular military reserves. So, not particularly useful in the beginning, maybe at the moment offering some potential for tapping different pools of manpower to replace losses. Now, what impact is this going to have for Russia and Africa? I think that really depends on how long the war lasts. If it's a short war, if, say, in a couple of weeks, they sign a peace agreement that is that can be tied to some lessening of sanctions, I don't think it will necessarily have a major impact on Russia's role in Africa. If the war draws out, I would expect in the longer term that Wagner's presence in Africa would collapse. Western countries at this moment, I believe it's actually this week that the British Parliament is holding hearings on the Wagner group, are basically raising this question of how should one deal with this quasi-state arm of Russia. And if one makes it if one puts political pressure on the governments that have been employing Wagner, if one issues arrest warrants for Wagner employees who are connected to potential war crimes, then it starts to become much more difficult to move people and money around. And Russian military aviation is probably overtaxed right now moving supplies towards Ukraine and can't really be bothered to ship stuff to Bangui or to Bamako.
So Russia is facing this dilemma with resources, and whatever the purpose of these militias were in special operations related to the war and assassination efforts and things that they plausible for plausible generality reasons the regular military or security services did not want to be seen as involved. They've clearly, first of all, showed their hand, and second of all, failed. So I don't know which part is worse for them, but clearly their own image is probably being undermined with their other clients if they are seen as not being able to succeed despite multiple attempts in whatever they were doing. It's not good for the brand.
No, certainly not.
And I wonder if they will be forced to rebrand it when this is all said and done at the end of the day.
Yes, no. If I was Wagner, I would definitely think about hiring somebody from Madison Avenue to try to remake my organization's PR campaign after this.
So here's the question, though. Despite these obvious limitations, Wagner still remains relatively well trained, relatively well funded. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, why did Russia has come to rely so much on these private efforts instead of keeping up and basically funding sufficiently and making sure its own regular military is in order, as we have seen it collapsed due to corruption and poor training and whatever else. And on the other hand, how do you compare this situation with Iran's reliance on RGC as opposed to its navy for various maritime operations?
So I think those are two. So the Wagner-Russian state relationship and the Iran IRGC relationship are two very different kettles of fish. So in some ways, it's been a question that has been raised a lot of times of why does the Russian state rely on Wagner as much as it does, and why does it keep private military companies theoretically illegal even as they are shipping Wagner around the world? So I don't think anybody's come up with a fully convincing argument for why are you sending Wagner to Syria, sending them to your airbase, posing with them, claiming that having a PMC in Russia is illegal, and that you can't mention the word Wagner. Well, on the other hand, making movies about your interventions that then Prigozhin has actually funded the creation of two movies that were relatively wide screening in Russia about Wagner's operations. So you're both intervening abroad, publicly trumpeting these interventions, making movies about them, but then keeping the entire phenomena illegal within Russia. So that the totality of it doesn't make perfect sense. So one argument that has been raised is that by using a private military company, when Russia wants to intervene, it reduces the political risks that it runs, both internationally and domestically. In a way, and this is not unique to Russia. One of the major reasons why the United States hired as many PMC or private personnel as it did in Iraq is that private military contractors don't get officially treated as war dead. So, in a way, Russia on the ground in Syria at most points had about 6,000 military personnel, but about a third of those were private military personnel, and those private military personnel were more frequently being used in frontline combat operations. Yeah, so 4,000 of the personnel who were physically on the ground in Syria were officers, advisors, artillery, aircraft mechanics, aircraft pilots, all of whom have a relatively small risk of dying. And 2,000 who were the Wagner employees were those who were supposed to seize oil fields and who oftentimes did suffer quite heavy losses. And there, the sort of explanation is that the Syrian intervention was not popular in Russia. Levada, the organization that does relatively, or at least prior to this current war, did relatively good polling in Russia, never found particularly, basically discovered a lot of public indifference to intervening in Syria. The Russian populace liked the idea of Russia being powerful and being influential, but also nobody wanted Russians to be dying for Assad's regime. So in that way, using a PMC lowers the political cost in Russia. In places in Africa, it also means that you get to intervene in places where you don't want to put your own political capital at stake. Wagner's intervention in Mozambique was a disaster. The Wagner forces in Mozambique were basically massacred, which makes me very curious how the movie they're apparently making about that is going to be, because Prigozhin is filming his sequel to Tourist, the action film on Wagner in the car is supposed to be Mozambique, where Wagner completely failed. Now, if Vladimir Putin had sent a battalion of Russian airborne troops as opposed to Wagner to Mozambique, and they'd been slaughtered, that would be very unpopular in Russia, but also Russia would feel some need to double down to wipe out the stain of a military disaster. So in a way, using a PMC basically enables you, once things go sideways, to distance yourself from the failed military operation. You can sort of walk away and say, oh, somebody signed a bad contract, and and that was bad for the people who took the job, in a way that sending regular forces doesn't. And I think this has been quite constructive for Russia's foreign policy of the last 10 years, which has oftentimes been one of acting as something of a spoiler for the West. Yeah, going into a lot of areas where Russia doesn't have clear foreign policy interests, but largely to troll Western interests.
So you have a foreign policy based on trolling, and meanwhile your own military is deteriorating and and is under-resourced, under-trained, under-supplied. That doesn't make any sense to me. But this also creates this whole understanding. I mean, you have an entire mythology based around Russia's pro-military image. You have all these people who are saying, oh, well, US can't face Russia because Russia is blah, blah, blah. But we're seeing that its conventional military capabilities are overrated, and its private military capabilities are also imperfect. They got slaughtered in Mozambique, and that's not even, that's that's not the US, that's not NATO, that's that's a group of jihadis.
And obviously I mean, Wagner's a very small, size-wise compared to the Russian military, it's very small. It's probably favoring something like Wagner as a tool of intervention has been marginally bad for the Russian military because, it's basically recruiting probably NCOs and experienced individuals from good Russian formation. So it's probably has created some form of brain drain from the regular military. But I think that the money probably being diverted to things like Wagner is drops in the bucket compared to the totality of corruption within the Russian military. I mean, in 2013, the chief prosecutor of the Russian military courts publicly said 20% of Russia's defense budget is disappearing into corruption. And during the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen things like a lot of armored vehicles don't really work because they did not buy, because in putting a contract with China for tires, they did not buy military specified tires. It's not that the Chinese tires are bad. I'm not sure whether China produces good military tires, but they did not buy the military spec tires.
So we'll never know.
They bought the tires that should be used on like construction equipment, and then they did. And my guess is that they did. That was not that they probably that some oligarch or purchasing agent's pockets or bank account got much larger by buying an inferior quality of tires and billing for a better quality of tires. But yeah, I mean, the Russian military is very much underperforming as a result of graft and corruption. Should we? I forgot to mention your point on your question about Iran and the IRGC Navy versus the regular Navy. In some ways, with Iran, it's almost, the situation's really different because the Revolutionary Guard is about the same size as the military. And it's about as equally institutionalized. So probably there, the better comparison is something like the U.S. Army versus the U.S. Marines. So you have a lot of duplication. Both the IRGC and the Army have long-range weapon systems. It's just that the IRGC has specialized in rockets and missiles, whereas the Army is specialized in artillery. Both the IRGC and the Army have infantry. Both have helicopters. Both have navies. So you get a lot of duplication. From my perspective, the fundamental reason why Iran has gone with this structure is the fears, going back to the origins of the Islamic Republic, of a coup. If you're the Ayatollah Khomeini and you've just come to power in 1979, you've inherited a military that was very much, where officers were very much promoted for their loyalty to the Shah. So how do you prevent this military from throwing a military coup against you as you become increasingly radical and as you increasingly marginalize the more democratic elements of the Iranian Revolution? I think the answer there was build a parallel military. But how does that military justify itself once the regular military has been populated by generations of officers who've also been vetted for their loyalty? Well, at that point, your parallel military has to, in some ways, do something different. And I think that's what one sees as the relationship between the Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian Navy. The Iranian Navy uses traditional ships, traditional warships, frigates, patrol ships. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has tried to specialize in almost swarm type attacks involving very fast motorboats, very small missiles. So in a way, it's adopted a different set of technologies to do the same purpose and is fighting for the budget with the Navy. Now, ultimately, this is probably stupid from a military point of view, in that splitting a limited budget, which is basically a budget to produce naval power between two separate organizations that are feuding with one another, is squandering resources. Although this type of rivalry might also lead to some form of innovation that could be very disruptive. So if the IRGC actually develops some clever combination of stealthy missile boats that are really effective against larger naval powers, then that could counterbalance the waste of resources, basically funding two navies when you're a middle power like Iran.
That's a good point. I wanted to come back to Ukraine for a couple of more questions before drawing a conclusion. Now we kind of thing. So a lot has been said about the so-called right-wing militias and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Ironically, nothing has been said about right-wing militias and neo-Nazis in Russia. So one of the main points of Russian propaganda, by the way, that has been quickly adopted by US media was the Azov battalion, which is no longer a militia at all, but part of the traditional regiment, restructured. Its former leadership has gone parted ways, and it's just another military unit, albeit with the same capabilities that caused Russians to fear it back in Mariupol in 2014. Why does this myth that it's still that it's a militia, that it's neo-Nazi, and that it's something anything other than a regular regiment persist in U.S. and Western political and media circles to this day? Why is this a story that benefits Russia's efforts, kind of, and that makes sense for them because it's one of the most effective reconnaissance and the counter-reconnaissance units? Why does it still persist so much? When the story has been, publicized, that it has been restructured, there's been a process, there's been a political process of recognition in the US with the US military. Why is the perception still so widely skewed, and why is the old news still kind of dominating the headlines?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good question. And I also am glad that you've raised this question, because I think that that the entire Azov battalion phenomena shows, is one of the few successful talking points that Russia has developed, and also shows how disingenuous their arguments are. So to one extent, I've always thought that if we have to ask who is the father of right-wing militias in Ukraine, I think the real answer is Vladimir Putin. The Azov battalion and some of the other militias that emerged in 2014 didn't do so because there was some large social movement that was pro-neo-Nazi. They didn't do so because that was where a lot of the Ukrainian population was. In the first post-Euromaidan parliamentary elections in Ukraine, only 13 out of 423 members of parliament were actually from the political far right. So that's about 3%. So if we compare that to most of Western Europe or the United States, probably the actual percentage of far-right members of Ukraine's legislature at the time that the Russians were making a big deal of Azov was an actually lower percentage. But as in many countries, when you get a lot of militias that form very quickly in response to the sort of disintegration of traditional military structures, oftentimes those come from politically fairly extreme groups. So, I mean, the Azov Battalion's case, there was a small number of very far right-wing individuals, some of whom had been invited, basically funded by the Russian government, to go talk to Russian right-wing events before the war. So some of the founders of the Azov Battalion were fairly tied in with the Kremlin-supported Russian neo-Nazi movement, which Vladimir Putin has been one of the most extensive bankrollers of Europe's far right for the last 20 years. But then the conflict occurs, and these individuals, as with the far right in a lot of places, have a certain paramilitary organization and can sort of serve as a nucleus for a lot of other less politically radicalized individuals to gravitate towards them and to fight against the Russians. So that's sort of the nucleus of Azov. It's not politically representative of Ukraine. It occurs because there's an invasion. There was not really any large-scale paramilitary right-wing organizations in Ukraine before the invasion. And then a lot of the 500 fighters who were active in Azov at its peak were certainly nationalistic, but did not adhere to anything like the neo-Nazi set of values of some of the core founders. So that's sort of the origins of Azov. Then in those first few months, Azov did prove to be very effective, particularly spearheading the retaking of Mariupol. But even by November of 2014, Azov was beginning to be integrated into the regular Ukrainian military. So why has it taken on this importance up till today? I'd say the first reason is the Azov Battalion was founded by neo-Nazis, and it did adopt something that looked like SS ruins for its flag. So that brings back extremely bad memories in a lot of the world. Secondly, it's because it's a convenient talking point for the Kremlin. If you want to delegitimize your opponents, you point to the one instance of some subset of your opponents who adhere to a very nasty ideology. Now, one should always emphasize how marginal this is. Azov was one of 37 volunteer battalions that were active in 2014. Those volunteer battalions collectively had 13,600 combatants. At its peak, volunteer battalions, though, sort of in the second half of 2014, didn't comprise more than 13% of the Ukrainian troops fighting against the Russians. So we're talking about a group that is a very small proportion of a very small proportion of the Ukrainian war effort. And it has been regularized, and the loathsome individuals who helped create Azov have gone their separate ways, as you said. Honestly, if I was Ukraine, I would have simply disbanded the unit. I can see why they didn't. Azov fought very well, and a large proportion of the individuals who were part of Azov were not neo-Nazis. So therefore, the Ukrainian state after the war decided to incorporate Azov into the National Guard. And it became just a normal military unit. But the fact of its continued existence has given the Kremlin something that it can point to and say, look, our opponents are neo-Nazis. Our opposing state, or the Euromaidan revolution, was orchestrated by right-wing neo-Nazis. It's false, but Ukraine in some ways did leave an opening that Russia has exploited to unfairly attempt to tarnish their opponents.
Meanwhile, there is continuing research suggesting that Putin is also behind funding some of the US neo-Nazis, and that some of these people have actually flocked to Ukraine to join Russia's efforts against, the regular Ukrainian military. There is also, talks about separate and various assorted neo-Nazi groups just operating in Ukraine, and whatever the case may be, there hasn't been any focus on trying to expose any of this, and there's also been a lot of discussion about Russian false flag operation with neo-Nazi crimes prior to the invasion for years, since 2014 or even before it, to justify the quote-unquote denazification, swastikas on cemeteries, things like, overturned tombstones, things of that nature, various violent incidents. None of it has been specifically tracked to anyone with a particular loyalty to the Ukrainian state. So how do we engage in this discussion on these actual neo-Nazi militias now? How do we do that without giving ammunition to Putin? And how do we expose the funding that ultimately may very well be tied back to Kremlin, including, the marginal groups in the US that are unfortunately gaining prominence thanks to successful information warfare efforts and polarization and this concerted effort to radicalize the mainstream?
It's a challenging act. I would say that I was just laughing when Putin gave his talk about denazification. I thought we should have immediately responded by offering to hold a transatlantic conference with Russia about denazification, and let's suss out all of the various Nazi adjacent groups and the patterns of funding that go to them. And yes, let's go after all of it. So, whether that is in the Ukraine or whether that's in Ukraine or the many areas where Russia is the primary financier of far right-wing movements. So yes, it was blatant hypocrisy that Vladimir Putin, who is very happy to stoke the far right in Europe and the United States, is on the other hand using the existence of a relatively marginal far right in Ukraine as the justification for invading the country. So I don't really know what one can do to stop that during a war. I think that after the dust is settled, we should definitely put on the table, yes, let's have let's establish an organization to try to reduce the transnational support for far right-wing ideological agreement groups. After the end of the conflict, I think that we probably ought to put more pressure on Ukraine as part of a sort of European, the process of inducting them into the EU to abolish or do everything they can to degrade these groups um, beyond the point where they are. Now, that's not to say that these groups are particularly strong in Ukraine. The far right in Ukraine is less significant than the far right in Hungary or the far right in Greece or any number of other European countries. We will soon see how strong the far right in France is when they have the next round of their elections in under 2 weeks. Um, but I think the answer is that while the conflict is going on, one should probably not dwell overly much on disingenuous talking points of the Kremlin. And once the conflict is over, um, let's do everything we can to reduce the real phenomena of far right or Nazi adjacent organizations within the European space. And that means also reducing Russia's ability to support those organizations.
I think that's a very fair point. My understanding is that in Ukraine, the far right groups, take the total of one parliament seat down from something like 3 in 2012, which is which meaning it wasn't all that great to begin with and became actually less over time. And the second issue is one of the Kremlin-linked parties actually was not quote unquote extreme right wing at all. It was a mainstream party that leaked sensitive information and during wartime and was rightfully shut down, which many people have criticized as undemocratic, but I can't imagine how this would not be considered treason under anyone's definition in any Western country. But yeah, yes, this far right wing populist group has benefited from Russian funding, but I don't see Ukraine being as much of a beneficiary of it as other countries that are far more prominent in European politics in general. So that all actually points to the concluding overall question that touches on many of the things you said earlier about the rot, the corruption, the proliferation of militias and all these armed groups and movements when state actors are facing disintegration. We see that in Ukraine, it's actually a reverse process. These groups are being increasingly either integrated into the standard units or being, losing power, losing any sort of influence as the federal powers are becoming more powerful forces. But elsewhere, we're seeing the opposite reaction. We're seeing in the Middle East a lot of these militias proliferating in African countries. We are even seeing the rise of some of these kind of units and groups across Europe in general. What does it say about the destabilization and ideological incoherence that the world is facing? How can we respond when the US itself is highly polarized on many issues and extremely, let's just say, unable to see through information warfare efforts or just deal with this sort of highly emotional, politically factionalized manipulations? What can Western countries facing their challenges from within do to deal with this external destabilizing growth of destabilizing elements?
Well, I guess the first point is the Ukraine's experience in basically regularizing and incorporating volunteer units into the regular military has been an extraordinarily successful one. And I hope that is that's studied and that to the extent possible, one may try to apply any relevant lessons from that to future efforts at security sector reform. Because one has seen that these similar efforts fail in lots of other places. I mean, the Libyan security sector reform effort to try to form a common Libyan army out of the many militias that had risen up to contest Muammar Gaddafi's regime completely failed. And those groups, rather than joining or being incorporated into a Libyan army, basically tore the state apart. So one should really ask, why was it so successful in Ukraine of being able to take these 37 volunteer battalions and combine them into what's a fairly centralized and functional National Guard? And is there anything there that can be replicated to other cases? I think there are probably some lessons, but they're probably imperfect. So Ukraine's case of how these militias arose was fairly untypical in that they rose in response to a foreign invasion. Usually, the rise of militias is a response to state failure. So, the rise of militias within the Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or even Syria. In those cases, militias arise when the central state collapses. So therefore, once a central state is reconstructed, the issue is, how does one get groups that basically formed in the absence of a central state and somehow put them together in a format that is obedient to a new central state? In Ukraine, the Ukrainian central state never disappeared. You had a change in regime, and you had a military that was paralyzed by that change of regime and by the culture within the officer corps, whereby the formal military did not fight for the first 5 months of a foreign attempt to detach parts of the country. So the fact that you had a central state meant that the Ukrainian volunteer battalions emerged fighting on behalf of a state and loyal to a state that did not necessarily, at the beginning, exercise direct control over them. So in some ways, that it was an easier process later to extend the state's control over these forces that were already ostensibly loyal to it. So the Ukrainian case may have lessons, but I think it's also a one whose success is going to be difficult to replicate. If we go more to your macro question of what is the risk of militiaization in sort of Western countries, I hope I'm not going to be proven wrong, but I think that the risks are still relatively minor, at least within Western Europe. The United States is its own ball of wax, and the level of polarization that occurred in the United States over the basically since President Trump's election in 2016 has been fairly extraordinary, as is the prominence of basically military-grade small arms in private ownership in the United States. So that's not to say that the U.S. central government could ever collapse and that you could end up with Libya-style militias, but there is the possibility in the United States that deepening polarization and an election considered illegitimate could lead some groups to basically start insurgency-style activities. How do you deal with that? I think that there's no simple answer. Obviously, reduce polarization. Obviously, for political actors on all sides to stop demonizing your opponents for normal behavior, on both political parties and more particularly on the Republicans, to try more actively to marginalize the most disruptive views within your own organization, But besides being able to implement a nationwide Finland-style strategy of turning electors into intelligent consumers of media who are better able to deal with misinformation or disinformation, um, it's it's a challenging task, which I hope that uh, our good leaders on both sides of the ideological divide will do what they can to master it while there's still time.
Well, I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of work to be done, but this was I think learning from these examples is something that will help us develop more effective strategies even for our domestic consumption, and certainly should serve as a warning of what can happen if taken, if the sort of splintering and ideological factionalism can be taken to its extreme end. Um, Thank you for lending us your insights today. That was very valuable, and thank you for your time. I hope we will have an opportunity to discuss more of these issues in the near future. Yes,
I would love the opportunity. Thanks a lot for the invitation onto your show, and it's been a pleasure discussing with you. And I learned a fair amount from it too. So, looking forward to the next opportunity, Arena.
thank you so much. Best of luck and everything.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.